Cool. All right. Yeah, so I am Mike Hartington. I'm not Jeff Cross. My beard is much better, and its Twitter account is much funnier. So follow. Apparently, someone made a Twitter for my beard, um, and they just post random things, and I have no idea who it is. So I don't want to find out because it just breaks the joke and breaks the illusion. Uh, but enough about my beard. We're going to talk about Ionic. We're going to talk about cool stuff that we've done in our 4.0 to better work with the Angular ecosystem and figure out why we've made these changes and historical reasons why those changes or why those details were actually implemented. So let's look back. We're going to have a few history lessons in here. Hindsight is always 20/20, so we have to look back to know where our mistakes were and why we need a change. So long ago, we found AngularJS, and I don't think any of it, I need to really sing the praises of AngularJS. I think we all know AngularJS was pretty awesome. For the features that it had at its time, it was pretty groundbreaking, and it allowed us at Ionic to create all these pretty cool components and create essentially a design system before the term design system was actually around, so we can kind of +1 hipster point right there. But it allowed us to create all these cool reusable components, everything that we really know about Angular directives, what became Angular components, and build up this really cool community all around the world. Then came the migration day. This was actually a really exciting day because Angular solved a lot of the technical issues and limitations that we found in AngularJS. We were super excited that the Angular team kind of invited us on as like early contributors and collaborators to get feedback. But as time kind of went on in that early process, we started to look at everything like, this is great, but we have our own opinions. Ionic focused historically on building native apps, so things that you would download from iOS and Google Play. And it had its own challenges and its own quirks that we wanted to be prepared for. Basically, how do we do native style navigation with web technologies? Do we actually need URLs? And this whole thing about a CLI, at the time, Angular CLI wasn't really a thing. And it wouldn't become something that existed for another year or so. So we had all of these kind of questions and all these ideas that we wanted to figure out, but we were kind of like, okay, we'll make our own decisions on this. So we maintained our own CLI, our own routing system, our own navigation, and basically an entire stack for Ionic apps for a couple of years. And we thought that that was going to be the best way to move forward and best way to maintain Ionic. And all the while, we would check in occasionally on Angular, and we would notice that Angular kept getting better. As Rob stated this morning, if you got rid of templates, if you give people a choice of templates or the CLI, people said, get rid of the templates. Don't take the CLI away from me. The CLI is actually probably the best part of Angular. There's also a lot of improvements that have landed in routing recently. A lot of that has to do with these dynamic imports. It's really simple to just take an app, split it out into lazy loaded bits, and have that just work. Plus the rest of the stack that exists in Angular as well, like internationalization extraction, NGRX, that whole micro ecosystem. Basically everything you could think of that makes Angular great is pretty awesome. So we came up with this really radical idea. Like, why don't we just let Angular do the Angular parts and we focus on building components? We're not a company that actually wants to write our own router. We're a team of like 5 people. We don't really need to write our own router, nor do we really want to write our own build system. We can barely keep up with some of the issues that come in just on components. So we looked at it and we were like, okay, can we use Angular for everything that Angular has to offer? Take all of that, build on top of it, reuse as much as possible, and focus on just building things that make Ionic great. So we started off with routing. and some historical context. With our 2.0 and our 3.0 and up until recently, we had this idea that URLs, they're not really that great. They're hard to store application state. They don't allow you to do arbitrary navigation, recreate app history. They are very limiting, the fact that you have to work within the browser's own capabilities. We created our own routing solution that basically said, what if application state and routing state was just an array? You want to go to a new component, you push that component onto the array. You want to go back, well, you pop. Simple metaphors to understand, like push to go to a new page. You want to go to another page 4 levels deep and insert all this history. You're doing array methods. You're just pushing all those components onto this stack. It was really simple. It was easy for people to kind of understand and get going with it, and it worked fairly well until this thing called progressive web apps became really popular. And people were like, hey, this is using web technology. I'm deploying to iOS and Android. I should just be able to take this, push this to a server or some hosting, and it just works, right? Well, not necessarily, because there wasn't URL support. We went back, we added all that. We added support for basically recreating Angular router, but in our own way. And I would argue not in a better way. There was a lot of work going in to maintain that, and there was a lot of limitations that actually came out of it. And I think probably the most frustrating part was that now there was separate documentation guides and blog posts like, oh, here's how to do something in Angular, and here's how to do something with Ionic's router. Even though Ionic was built on top of Angular, it kind of became this, why do we have our own way? So to kind of look at what that is, before, we used to have this thing called, laser pointer's not that great. We'll skip that. We'll used to have this thing called Ionic page module, where we'd pass in for child, and then the component that we wanted to lazy load. Now this looks similar enough to Angular's router, except you could only do one component at a time. So you'd have this super complicated, that's so much better. Thank you, person. Yo, it's green, that's cool. So yeah, you could only pass in this one component. You couldn't do an array of components. You couldn't have, a lot of your app split out into its own chunk. Everything had to be its own chunk, and we'd get all these, I would say, over-architecting of apps. So this is how we would set it up. When we'd go to the actual component itself, we had this Ionic page decorator, where we could have a URL segment, and then this ability to just specify, hey, what's some default app history, so that way when my users land on this deep link, they have some kind of context to go back to. Again, this kind of was limiting, because now this Ionic page decorator was a build time process. Angular doesn't support custom decorators in AOT, so we'd have to rewrite this, do a whole lot of complicated things. And again, it looks like it's better, but I would argue that it probably made more work for us. And then when we want to push into it, we just call our nav controller, and then pass in a string reference to that page. Why a string reference? Because we thought that was a great idea. It did, however, allow us to do these really cool things where we could pass in full objects instead of just random key values. So we could have a lot more complicated data structures, but then again, if you load this page and you don't have this object in memory, what are you actually rendering? Nothing. There's nothing to actually render because you don't have the data. So again, it sounds like all good ideas, but it's really kind of just, it doesn't work out and doesn't scale well. So we moved over to the router for Angular 4, and this has actually worked out really, really well for us. So not only did we move over to the router, we actually built on top of the router component to provide like all these great animations, gesture support, without having to reteach people a new API. So for this, we have our standard kind of router config. And what we're actually doing is just using dynamic imports to load the different modules. It's basically whatever you are getting from an Angular ng, it doesn't exist yet, never mind. From a standard Angular app, it's just path, component, load child, or load children. It's fairly approachable, and you kind of know it once you've read the docs. What's important here is this Ion router outlet component towards the bottom. Now, this behaves exactly the same way as Angular's router outlet, except was that as you navigate throughout your app, you actually get all these really cool animations built in for free. So nothing about my app actually knows how these animations are added. You're still using things like router link or the router API. These just happen automatically because of this router outlet component. So pretty powerful stuff. What's great here is that this just works and I don't have to learn a new API. It's the same thing I got from Angular. Now, this is what we at Ionic call an example of linear navigation, meaning there's only one place for a route to be rendered, and there's only one place or one instance of application history in the entire app. Most apps these days actually don't do this. They have tab-based applications. So if you go on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, basically everything is going to have these little buttons towards the bottom which could have their own independent history. So how do we do that in Ionic? Well, again, taking that same concept of let's just use what Angular Router provides, we create this pretty nice chaining event where we have our top-level component, called tabs in this case, and then we pass it an array of children routes, each one of those representing an individual tab button down towards the bottom. We map those back to the tab button, back to the main path, and inside of that path, we can render whatever we want. Arbitrary routes, whatever we want to have in there, and it just works. So as we tab throughout our application, we could have 3 independent navigation stacks, and all of them will maintain their own history. You could switch between each one of them and just have tab 1 go 3 levels deep, tab 2 go a couple levels deep, and switch in between that and still have that back button be persisted. Now, this is what I think would be a pretty awesome feature, and I wish this was built into the Angular router, but it's pretty simple to just build on top of Angular router and add this feature in. It's something that we call stack navigation, where all these navigation concepts and all these navigation kind of outlets can exist at the same exact time without having to, without conflicting with one another. And it brings that really great experience that people expect from like native apps, but also adds the cool thing of having a clean URL that you can share to all your friends and have that deep linking experience. So it's kind of bridging best of both native and the web, and we're pretty excited about it. Now, history lesson part 2. Let's talk about CLIs and build tools and transpilers and languages. When we started building Ionic 2, we were still used to gulp. Some of us were more comfortable with grunt.js, but gulp was the cool thing to do. Then we found browserify, and then we were told about system.js, and apparently Webpack existed at that point, which I wasn't aware of. I didn't know Webpack was that old. And I was always used to writing ES5, but then we found out, hey, you can write this fancy new JavaScript using this thing called 6to5, which eventually became Babel. We have Tracer, and then CoffeeScript was really popular for some reason. And then Angular team was like, hey, we made our own language. It's called AtScript. It existed for like 3 weeks. There was all these different options. And this has only gotten worse, I would argue. There's so many different options and so many different tools out there that you could pick from. What's the difference between all of them? I don't know. It's all really confusing. I just kind of, I don't know, throw my arms up. I just want to watch a cat. So it's a lot better these days. We can pretty much say with a lot of confidence that all the build tools are really great. Parcel, Webpack, Rollup, whatever one you want to pick, go for it. Have fun. It'll do what you want it to do. What's important as an Angular developer, I don't really care what tool I use. Angular could switch that out under the hood, and I don't worry about it because the CLI just takes care of it for me. I don't have to maintain my own build chain. I don't have to worry about it. I can be happy. Now in Ionic 2, we created this thing called Ionic App Scripts. And I have a complicated I have a lot of feelings about Ionic App Scripts. It was really cool at the beginning because we did things that the Angular CLI did before the Angular CLI existed. In fact, when Angular CLI was released, we were still maintaining app scripts, and Angular CLI still had bits of Ember CLI in it for a little bit of meta kind of CLI tooling. Now we did this, we created AOT compilation, TypeScript compilation, Sass compilation, all these really cool things, image assets being copied over. But we're component developers. We're not build tool experts. We spent a lot of time working on things like how to configure Webpack. There is no joke there. That was literally just, we were trying to figure out how to configure Webpack because it would change every major version, and we were just like, okay, now we have to go, what's new in Webpack 3.0? What's new in Webpack 4.0? Same thing with all the other tools that existed, and figuring out how to do this in a way that was fast, maintainable, and we didn't have to spend all of our time doing this was difficult. And much like the router, we have this kind of split where you would have the Ionic way of doing things and the Angular way of doing things, even though we were built on top of Angular. So what did we do? Again, like the router, we moved over and we just said, let's just use the Angular CLI. It's stable, it's fast, it works. We don't have to maintain a build tool. We don't have to learn Webpack. That alone right there would be reason enough. There's also a lot of cool features inside the Angular CLI that we'll look at in a second. So it's easier for the community because now they just have to know one option. We build on top of that, we integrate with it, and it just works. If Angular decides, hey, Webpack is no longer maintained, let's go to something else. Or hey, Basil, that's a thing, let's actually use that. We, as component developers, really don't care. And the community, they have ng add Angular Basil, and they can be happy about it. It's like, we don't care how an Angular app actually needs to be built. Let Angular figure that out, and our users can just use our components in Angular. But like I said at the beginning, we have a lot of opinions about how things should be done. Thankfully, there's things like Schematics and the Builder API that Rob mentioned earlier to make all of this possible. So we can customize our building experience for iOS and Android platforms. We can customize the components and create these new things called pages without having to go through and rebuild all this tooling ourselves. Schematics and builders are really an awesome feature. And I wish there were more docs on it, but I am told they are coming soon. So when that actually will land, who knows? So we talked a little bit about the Ionic stuff. What else is going on there? We have a lot more that we are also doing, and I think they're pretty cool stuff. Has anyone used CSS variables before? Like 10 people? CSS variables are literally the only reason, CSS variables solve the only reason I was using Sass, and that was have dynamic values. CSS variables are essentially the same thing, where you have a token and then a value, and you can reuse that inside of your entire app. The only thing here is that it's built into the browser, so there's no build time. You can update these things whenever you want. Media queries, as we see over here, you could update them through JavaScript. You get to do cool things like dark mode because, yes, everything should have a dark mode nowadays. And yeah, no build tools, which is pretty awesome. And this dark mode over here really is just being driven by this small block of CSS. The first 2 lines, I'm literally just swapping the background color and the foreground color, and the rest of this is actually all generated for me. So I kind of cheat. I just pass it those 2 options, and it figures everything out, which is pretty nice. And then, oh, it's not going to play anymore. Oh well. But we get dark mode out for free, and this could be custom user themes, whatever you would expect to get from an app. Craig talked earlier about server-side rendering in Angular with Universal, and we figured, hey, progressive web apps, having a fast paint and having a fast loading experience really is important. So let's go ahead and make Ionic actually server-side renderable. be able to be rendered on the server. So we go through, we've made this whole process, we integrate with all the official tooling, and it's as simple as adding Ionic server module to your server app.server.module and having that just kind of work with the existing tooling. So something we're really excited about. And then we're also looking at things like the Angular CDK, because, yeah, virtual scrolling is really difficult to maintain. So we've worked through and like, hey, can we use Angular's CDK and the virtual scroller component in an Ionic app? Turns out we can. This is a list of like 10,000 items coming in from a database, and the scrolling performance is actually really great. I'm currently working on making sure that this integration story works really well. And if anyone has any comments or has used a virtual scroller before, I'd love to know your experience with it and if you think it's actually worthwhile. No, yeah, the heights. Heights are always difficult. So with Ionic, we did a lot on mobile, but now we feel like desktop is probably something we should also care about. So Chrome has this thing where you can actually install progressive web apps to your home screen, to your laptop now. We should actually care about that with things like things like date pickers and having all these other components just adapt to these larger form factors. Having everything just look like a large version of your phone doesn't really cut it anymore. And then we've been doing a lot of thinking on this whole write once, run anywhere. Traditionally, this has been the goal and has been pretty difficult to achieve. A lot of reasons, like the architecture and tooling with like projects like Cordova have been painful, and it has been not a great experience for most people. So how do we get to this place where we have iOS, Android, web, Electron, whatever target could exist, all these APIs just working together and not having to do a bunch of if iOS, if Android, if Electron, do this and handle things differently. And that's with this new project called Capacitor. We launched Capacitor a week ago. It finally hit its 1.0, and it really rethinks on how you can take this whole write once, run anywhere approach and pushes that to what I think is the limits. So I wasn't going to try to tempt npm install on Wi-Fi. So I thought ahead, which I'm very proud of myself, and recorded a video of how to add this to an Angular project. You just run ng-add @capacitor Angular. It'll go through, install everything. It's going to spit out some warnings, so I apologize. I don't have everything up to date all the time. I'm a developer. I'm not perfect. But after that run, it runs this whole thing. Like, what's your app's name? That's my app's name. What's the actual package ID for when you submit it to the store? Does that? Which package manager do you want to use? NPM or Yarn? We're pretty smart people, so we'll use NPM. And then from there, we can just say npx add a project cap, add this platform. And that's it. I've just had my Angular project, and I've created an Android project. I can open that up in Android Studio, deploy, and it just works. Any of the APIs, the plugins, are already there and added for you without having to actually manage all of that yourself. So it takes that API and it figures out, hey, if I'm building for iOS, do it this way. If I'm building for Android, do it that way. If I'm building for the web, do it that way. It really simplifies that whole process from a developer's perspective by providing a abstracted API on top of it. So for example, to write to a file or write a file to the file system, we're only going to know that we have a file system kind of object. We're going to call the method on it, pass in all this information, and it just works. Like, we don't care if we're on iOS or Android. We just know I want to write it to the documents folder. Here's the data. Here's the name. Handle it for me, which I think is pretty nice. Like I said, we provide some polyfills for fallback, so if file system doesn't work in anywhere that is not Chrome, which it's not many places these days. But Safari, Firefox, they do exist and people do use them, so we should figure out how to polyfill that, or at least provide a better fallback experience. The ng add schematic that I showed a little bit last slide is out. Really easy to just add it to a project, and if you find out this isn't really for me, remove it. You don't need to do anything. It doesn't modify your actual app itself. It just adds to it. So really nice. And that's kind of it. I mean, we've gone through this whole whirlwind experience at Ionic of being able to say, hey, what can we do if we don't focus on a build chain or if we don't focus on a router? We can make our components great. That's kind of awesome. We can make all the tooling that we have to deal with a lot faster. That's cool. We can create new platforms like Capacitor and just solve all these other problems without having to focus too much on how do we solve Angular. Angular pretty much knows how to manage itself. We don't need to do it for them. So we can focus on what makes Ionic great and just provide those great components that everyone knows and loves. I didn't mean to do that. Thank you.